June 1968, Burbank, California. NBC Studios, Building 3, a windowless dressing room with a single bulb burning over a mirror. A 33-year-old man in black leather sits very still, staring at his own reflection, and he does not like what he sees. His name is Elvis Presley, and in 6 days he is supposed to walk out under studio lights in front of a live audience for the first time in 7 years, and he is, by every account of the people standing outside that door, terrified. To understand why a man who had once been the most famous face on the planet could be afraid of a television studio, you have to understand what the 7 years before it had done to him. Since 1961, Elvis had not performed live. Not once. He had made picture after picture, 27 of them in that stretch, most forgettable, songs written to formula and shot in 11 days flat, love interests who changed with the production schedule, a career that had become, in the words of one Hollywood trade paper, a machine that makes money and nothing else. He had not stood on a stage and felt an audience breathe with him since before the Beatles existed. The world had moved on without asking his permission. Now, NBC wanted a Christmas special, and Colonel Parker had sold it to them as exactly that, a Christmas special, and the men producing it, particularly a young director named Steve Binder, had a different idea entirely. They wanted Elvis, not the movie Elvis, not the Colonel's Elvis, the one from Memphis, sweating through a shirt in a room full of people who loved music more than money. Back in Tupelo, Mississippi, the boy Elvis had once been slept in a 2-room shotgun house his father built with his own hands, and there had been years when there was no money for anything at all, when a bowl of biscuits and gravy was the whole of supper, and a new pair of shoes was something you prayed for instead of expected. That boy had grown up believing that the world owed him nothing, and somewhere in the marble hallways of Graceland and the sound stages of a dozen forgettable pictures, that belief had curdled into something heavier. A fear that none of it had been earned, that it could all be taken back as easily as it had been given. Those who worked closest to him in that period, men like Charlie Hodge and Joe Esposito, would say later that Elvis rarely spoke the fear aloud, but it showed in small ways, in how he picked at his food before rehearsals, in how he'd disappear for an hour at a time into an empty room with his guitar, and come out having played nothing anyone could hear through the door. Binder had assembled a team that summer that understood the stakes, even if the network did not. The show was being built around a loose, unscripted format, small combo numbers, a gospel medley, and at its center, a live sit-down segment where Elvis would simply talk and sing with musicians who had known him since Sun Records, stripped of orchestration, stripped of choreography, stripped of everything that had insulated him from an audience for the better part of a decade. It was, by design, the single most exposed a performer of his stature had been in years. There would be no editing room to hide in, no 35th take. Binder wanted it raw because he believed that was the only version of Elvis the public still wanted to see. Elvis, walking the lot each morning past posters for his own recent pictures, was not sure the public wanted to see him at all anymore. Binder had told him something in their first meeting that had lodged itself somewhere behind Elvis's ribs and would not come loose. He'd said, "Elvis, you're the biggest joke in the industry right now. Nobody takes you seriously anymore." It was not cruelty. It was a dare. But 6 days before taping, alone in that dressing room with a comb in his hand and a mirror that did not lie, the dare had curdled into something closer to dread. He had not sung in front of a crowd since a different decade. He did not know if his voice still did what it used to do. He did not know if the boy from Tupelo was still in there somewhere, underneath the karate moves and the movie contracts and the 7 years of somebody else's decisions. Charlie Hodge, his old friend and guitar man, would say later that those were some of the darkest days he ever saw Elvis go through, not because anything tragic had happened to him, but because for the first time in his adult life, Elvis Presley did not know if he still had it. That same week, 400 miles south in a rented house near Old Tucson, Arizona, another man was between pictures. John Wayne was 60 years old that June, freshly out of surgery 2 years earlier that had cost him a lung, and he was, by his own account to friends, in no hurry to slow down. He had just finished directing and starring in The Green Berets, a film that had drawn sharp criticism in the press for its politics, and he had weathered it the way he weathered most things, by getting up the next morning and going back to work. Wayne understood something about being reduced to a symbol that very few men in Hollywood could claim to understand. By 1968, he had spent nearly 4 decades being called, depending on who was talking, an American icon, a relic, a hero, a punchline, sometimes all 4 in the same afternoon edition of the same newspaper. He had lost a lung 2 years earlier and told almost no one outside his immediate circle because he did not believe the myth built up around him left room for the man to be sick. He had learned the hard way and over a long career that the bigger the image got, the smaller the space left for the actual person standing inside it. It was a lesson that had cost him more than a few quiet nights he never discussed publicly. So when word reached him that a younger performer, one he did not know well but respected, was drowning in that exact same current, something in him recognized it immediately, the way one man recognizes a limp in another man's walk because he has favored the same leg himself. Wayne and Presley were not close friends. They ran in different rooms of the same town, but they had crossed paths more than once over the years, at studio functions, at a handful of industry dinners, in the kind of brief, respectful exchanges 2 famous men have when neither one particularly needs anything from the other. What connected them more than friendship was recognition. Wayne had watched from a distance as a kid from Mississippi got turned into a punchline by the same industry that had once tried to do the same thing to him. And more than one person close to both men would later say that Wayne understood something about Elvis's situation that almost nobody else in Hollywood did. The particular loneliness of being more myth than man, of having an image so large that people stop being able to see the person standing inside it. The story, as it has been told by those in Presley's circle over the years, is that word reached Wayne through a mutual contact, a stuntman named Chuck Robertson, who had worked with Wayne for 2 decades and who had a cousin on Binder's production crew. The message was simple. Elvis was scared, really scared. Scared in a way nobody around him knew how to fix because everybody around him needed him to be fine. Wayne did not know Elvis well enough to call him out of nowhere and say so, but he picked up the phone anyway. The call came through to the NBC switchboard on a Tuesday evening 4 days before taping. It took nearly 10 minutes to get routed back to the small production office where Elvis was going over song selections with Binder and the arranger Billy Goldenberg. A secretary put her hand over the receiver and said the name twice before anyone in the room reacted because nobody quite believed it. John Wayne on the line for Elvis. Elvis picked up the phone slowly, the way a man picks up something he is not sure is real. What was said in that first call has never been transcribed anywhere, and neither man ever spoke about it publicly in detail. What is documented, through the recollections of Charlie Hodge, and later through an offhand remark Wayne made to a reporter in 1971 that he quickly waved off as nothing really, is that the 2 men talked for the better part of 40 minutes, and that by the time Elvis hung up the phone, something in his shoulders had changed. According to Hodge, Wayne had not offered advice about singing. He had not talked about television or ratings or comebacks. He had talked instead about being watched, about the particular strangeness of a life where millions of people believe they know exactly who you are, and how a man can start to believe he owes them the performance of that person even when the person underneath is tired or scared or simply human that day. Wayne told him, according to Hodge's account years later, that the worst mistake a man in their position could make was trying to become the myth. The minute you start playing yourself, Wayne reportedly said, you've already lost the thing that made people care about you in the first place. 2 days later, on the Sunday before taping began, John Wayne showed up at the NBC lot in Burbank. He had not been asked. He had not been announced. He simply arrived in a plain jacket and no entourage and asked the guard at the gate if he could see Elvis Presley. Word moved through the studio the way it always does, in a low ripple of disbelief. Crew members who had spent the week watching Elvis grow quieter and more withdrawn by the day now watched John Wayne walk across the soundstage floor toward his dressing room, and more than one of them stopped what they were doing to see it happen. Elvis opened the door himself. Those who were nearby would later say that for a moment neither man said anything at all, that Wayne simply looked at him, the way an older man looks at someone he recognizes something of himself in, and then put out his hand. They talked for close to 2 hours behind a closed door. Binder, who had been trying without much success all week to get Elvis to relax enough to run through the show's opening number, has said in interviews that whatever happened in that room, Elvis walked out of it a different man. Not fixed, not suddenly fearless, but steadier. Like something that had been leaning too far to one side had come back level. What Wayne actually said to him that afternoon has been the subject of more speculation than fact over the years. But one detail has been repeated consistently enough by people who were on that production, including a sound engineer named Bones Howe, that it has become something close to an accepted piece of studio lore. Wayne reportedly told Elvis that he had watched him on newsreels back in the 50s, watched the mania around him, and had thought at the time that no young man alive could survive being worshipped that hard without losing something of himself along the way, and he told him that the only cure he had ever found for that particular kind of exhaustion was to stop performing the myth and start doing the work. Not the show. The work, the singing itself, stripped down to just a man and a guitar and a room full of people who wanted to hear him. "Get back to what you actually do," Wayne reportedly said. "Let the rest of it take care of itself." Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. 4 days later, on June 27, 1968, Elvis Presley sat down on a small stage built to look like a boxing ring, with a handful of musicians who had played with him since Memphis, in front of an audience close enough to touch, and he picked up a guitar he had not held with intention in years. The black leather suit had been Binder's idea, but the way Elvis wore it that night, loose-shouldered, sweating, laughing between takes at his own nerves, was not direction. It was a man who had, for the first time in nearly a decade, stopped trying to be anything other than exactly what he was. The special aired on December 3rd, 1968. It was the highest-rated program on American television that night. Critics who had written Elvis off as a relic of a past decade were, almost without exception, stunned. The New York Times called it a return to form so complete that it was difficult to remember he had ever been away. Within a year, Elvis was back in a recording studio making music people actually wanted to hear. And within 18 months, he was standing on a stage in Las Vegas in front of a live audience for the first time since 1961, launching the second act of a career that would define the next decade of his life. None of it happened because of a single conversation. Careers do not turn on one afternoon, and nobody close to either man ever claimed otherwise. Binder's vision, the musicians who had played with Elvis since Memphis, the months of preparation, all of it mattered more, by any honest accounting, than 40 minutes behind a closed door. But those who were there that week have never stopped insisting that something shifted after Wayne's visit, something in how Elvis carried himself for the remaining days of rehearsal, a looseness that had not been there before. Whatever else built the comeback, that afternoon seemed to clear a path for it. Charlie Hodge would say, decades later, in one of the last interviews he gave before his own death, that he never forgot the sight of Elvis opening that dressing room door and finding John Wayne standing on the other side of it. "I don't know exactly what Duke said to him in there," Hodge said, "but I know Elvis walked out of that room like a man who'd been given something he didn't know he was allowed to have. Permission, maybe. Permission to just be who he already was." The two men never became close friends after that. They saw each other occasionally over the following decade, at industry events, at the odd shared dinner table, always cordial, always brief. Wayne, by all accounts, never made much of what he had done, brushing off the one reporter who ever asked him about it directly with a shrug and a change of subject. It was not the kind of thing he considered worth talking about. He had simply heard that a man he respected was struggling, and he had gotten in his car. Elvis, for his part, kept something from that period that his stepbrother David Stanley would later describe finding among his personal effects at Graceland after his death in 1977. It was a small, unremarkable item, a promotional lobby card from a Wayne picture, signed simply, "To Elvis, get back to work, J.W." Stanley has said Elvis kept it in a drawer near his bed for the rest of his life, not displayed, not talked about, just kept close, the way a man keeps the things that mattered most quietly, without needing anyone else to understand why. Bones Howe, who spent his career behind the mixing boards of some of the era's biggest recordings, said once in an interview that he had worked with a great many nervous performers in his time, but never watched a transformation quite like the one he saw in Elvis that week in June. Monday, he could barely look at the band, Howe recalled. By Thursday, he was cracking jokes between takes like he'd never left the stage in his life. Howe never claimed to know exactly what had caused the change. He only knew what he had witnessed with his own eyes, and he never forgot it. There is no plaque for this story. No museum case, no framed letter under glass. What there is, instead, is a single afternoon in June of 1968, when one of the most famous men in the history of American entertainment walked uninvited into a dressing room to remind another famous man of something the whole world had temporarily forgotten, that underneath myth, there had always just been a person, and that the bravest thing either of them ever did in their careers was choose, every so often, to be exactly that. If this story of two icons and one quiet act of encouragement moved you, it would mean a great deal if you'd consider subscribing and leaving this video a like. Have you ever had someone show up for you at exactly the moment you needed the most, without you ever having to ask? Tell us about it in the comments below. And if you want more true stories about the humanity hiding behind music's biggest legends, don't forget to ring that notification bell.